In this video, I wanted to talk about how to attach entredeux to collars, because collars are a curved shape and that can be a bit tricky. The supplies needed for this are laid out in front of you. I've got a little metal stainless steel spatula that I use for pressing. I want to use my 60 weight Mettler sewing thread, or you could use a 50 weight cotton thread by DMC as well. I always use my open-toed foot. You're going to need a little bit of Scotch tape, and when I'm sewing I always use my mag eyes for this application because you really need to see closely. The first thing that you're going to do is sew your collar together on the seam line and then give it a good press. And sometimes you get some little slightly bumpy areas. This really isn't bad, but I use this spatula when I'm pressing. If there's any areas that I feel like need to get smoother, you can kind of smooth out the little bump. You can leave it in there and then press it again. Because this is such a long spatula, that works well. You won't burn your fingers when you're doing that. So step one is to sew the collar together and then press it with the right sides out. Your entredeux will come with two fabric on both sides of the holes. What you want to do is first trim one side of the entredeux right next to the entredeux edge. So I'm showing you here just how close I get. You don't want to leave threads behind that are going to fray. You want to get right next to that hard edge of entredeux. The next thing you do is clip it, and I clip about every ½ inch or so. If the curve is tighter, you may need to clip a little bit more closely, like maybe every ¼ inch around the tighter curve of the collar and every ½ inch where there's not as much of a curve. The next step is to use your glass head pins. You do not want to use plastic pins for this because the plastic heads can melt. And I've got the collar pinned down to my padded surface. I typically do this on my ironing board, but I've got it on my little quilting press here so that I could demonstrate. So you want to pin your entredeux all the way around the outside edge of the collar, and you want to make sure that the outside edge of the entredeux is flat, because you're taking a straight piece and wanting it to go around a curve, and when that happens there's a little bit of buckling in the center, and that's normal. You'll have that. So as you pin it all the way around the outside curve of the collar, and then you want to give it a really good steam press, and you can see that there are little areas where it's ever so slightly buckled, or it's just not as smooth, the inside curve, as the outside is, and that's the way it's going to be. The next step is to take your Scotch tape and tape these together, because if you don't tape these together, the tendency will be, as you start stitching around the curve, to straighten that out. It's easier if it's straighter, but that will cause the collar to buckle under when you are finished. So you want to make sure that you keep these curved areas curved as you go around. So I tape it a lot. I want to make sure all those pieces stay where they're supposed to be. Once it's all taped, you can remove your pins, and then you're ready to stitch. And again, I'm using my 60 weight Mettler thread, and I use a size 70 Microtex needle with that. And then you're going to set your sewing machine to a small zigzag. And you do have to experiment a little bit because each entredeux is going to be slightly different. So I will typically start out by testing up here in the seam allowance area. My zigzag is usually somewhere around a 2.0 in width and maybe a 1.0 or a 0.8 in length. So test your entredeux first to see which settings you need, and then always use your needle down option when you're stitching this. So the next step is to go ahead and zigzag the entredeux to the collar, and I will be removing the tape as I come to it because you don't want to stitch over the tape. I did end up with a stitch setting of a 2.0 width and a 1.0 length, and now I'm going to go ahead and put my mag eyes and stitch around the collar. It's always a good idea when you start to test your entredeux to do the first few stitches by hand cranking the machine. And then I get as close as possible to the tape, and then I remove that piece of tape. When you start to get to these curved areas where you need to encourage that inner line of the entredeux to stay against the fabric, because you know it wants to bunch up, I find it helpful to use an awl or some other type of pointy object to help guide your entredeux while it's under the foot. And there you have it. The entredeux has been stitched to the collar all the way around. Now I'm ready to trim off the fabric on the other side of the collar so that you can either apply lace or do a decorative stitch or whatever you have in mind.